Matt Jordan, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast for the third time, I believe.
I do believe. Yeah, it's been a while. Great to see you again.
Likewise. I'm just looking at myself here on the left, I'm certain looking a little bit more dishevelled.
I know.
You're looking fresh
Is it?
though, looking very
Uh,
well.
it is absolutely an optical illusion. I'm feeling anything but fresh. I feel wilted,
Nice. But it
and
is a
and you
cool.
have good reason. You have good reason for feeling a little tired, sir.
Yes,
Congratulations,
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
baby Alice. So
Yeah,
cute.
14 weeks in to the
Amazing.
chaos. And I was asking you, why
Congrats.
did no one tell me what it was going to entail?
Oh yeah.
Because you
I
just
always
get
tell
you
people. Yeah.
not to go into the baby chat too much, but you just get the old oh, enjoy your sleep while you can get it. And you're like,
Oh, I know. You're like,
do
what?
one, give over. But then
What?
I'd probably do the same.
Yeah.
I'd probably do
No.
the
No.
same.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Agreed.
a little bit of bio from you, a little bit of an intro. I mean, I know the longer ones people can dive into previous episodes
No.
that
Yeah.
you've come to get that you've come on and joined me for. But a bit of an
Yeah.
update would be the order of the day, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I always say, my roots are as a strength and conditioning coach and a sport physiologist. It's kind of where I spent the bulk of my career. But the update is that, yeah, after a long time in the world of Olympic sport and, face to face with athletes and doing what I love, a position came up here at the University of Calgary, a professor position, well, assistant professor position over in kinesiology and kind of affiliated with our sport medicine center. And yeah, so I took it. I mean, I took the job, and it's great because I mean, the only thing I love more than coaching athletes and being on the floor is working with students and teaching and being around people who love to learn about the things that we love to talk about. So um, I couldn't be happier. Yeah, so I'm in that role and continue to forge ahead with online digital education for sport science, sport medicine, strength and conditioning practitioners, and yeah, things are good. Things are good.
But that's still a big part of it is still with the institute. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm still absolutely. So the Canadian Sport Institute Calgary, which is like, I kind of call it my first home. It's one of four Olympic training centers. I've got a quarter of my time carved off to keep running our return to performance research program. Like it's kind of like the main push is all of the work that we put in around how the neuromuscular system, becomes impaired after ACL injury and how we help athletes get back to health, back to sport, back to performance. And, big emphasis on back to performance. Like that's what we care about. And it's a bit nebulous, but in terms of how to define that. But, we've got a beautiful strength and power lab. I've got some awesome students, people I work with. Nate Morris, Drew Lawson, both graduated with their masters recently, and they're killing it up there. Isabel Aldrich Witt, who's a physiotherapist, who's also doing her master's with Walter Herzog and myself, who's just killing it as well. And literally, it's a cool environment. I'm not up there as much as I used to be and as much as I would like because of the new job, but now we got Izzy's our physio. She's seeing like 10, 12 athletes a day back to back, collecting data, doing working her magic. I'm just so honored to be working with with that crew at the Institute. So yeah, absolutely still there. And I couldn't do it without them. So it's a big part of my identity and my love for what I do.
Sounds like a good balance. Sounds like a really cool balance for you. But
Yeah, it is.
one thing I want to dive into with you today is movement efficiency. And as we talked about before, murky area, but one that you did very well to navigate in High Performance Training for Sports second edition. And I
Yeah.
obviously that looked at the list and saw that that's the chapter that you'd taken on. And I thought,
Yeah.
I wonder how this is gonna go. Where is this? It's probably one of the ones that you just don't know how it's gonna turn out,
Oh,
which way direction you go with it. But so hopefully we can dive into that chapter
yeah.
and your
Yeah,
thoughts and
man.
build it out a little bit. So the
Great
first
tee
thing,
up. Can I
yes,
can I just and can I just add just a one little bit of flavor for the viewership and audience
go.
that might be listening is when DJ Dave Joyce said, "Hey Matt, I want you to write on this topic." I didn't get to choose this. It was assigned to me. And I was saying to you before we kicked this off, like I absolutely knew, as you said, I was getting into the murky waters of a very nebulous topic and a challenging topic, and yeah, I knew full well what I was getting into, and let's just say it was a hard one to write, not because I didn't enjoy the process, and certainly not because I wasn't interested in it, but because of how hard it is to write about this topic. So
Hmm.
we'll get into it.
Teed up perfectly. The tee up for the tee up.
Yeah.
So first, I suppose the first place to start is what looks like an easy question, but what is movement efficiency?
Oh, I
What's
couldn't
your
even.
version of movement efficiency?
I couldn't even. Here's how complicated this was in my head. I didn't even want to say movement efficiency.
Okay.
I actually wanted to call it efficiency of movement. And I know, I know you're like, what are you talking about? Because there are well-held, exercise physiology constructs like mechanical efficiency that describe things that we actually measure and understand a bit better, right? And so when I was writing, as I was going along, this first step was talking about how do I capture this in an authentic way, and I kind of went back and forth a little bit to say, I want to keep it efficiency of movement and not movement efficiency, so as not to confuse the readers about where I stood on the topic. Anyways, so I mean, the first part's kind of easy to write about, I think, which is we understand the mechanical or the bioenergetic term mechanical efficiency. So that was a relatively fun piece to write because I took it from the angle of what was obviously we generate a certain amount of energy, and just like a car, we are not perfectly efficient when we transfer that internal energy into external work. So we lose stuff in the process, and that's just by virtue of the fact that we are you lose energy to inefficiencies, to whatever else that might be happening. So the first part obviously is I dove in pretty heavily on mechanical efficiency, and I took the angle of talking about the neuromuscular system, which is where obviously my passions lie. So talking about some properties of muscle and how they might adapt to training, and the things that may influence mechanical efficiency. And then that was the first half, and then the second half was really the challenge where I think talking to Dan Noble. I don't know if you've ever interviewed Dan, but he's a strength coach from Toronto, and he happened to be in Calgary for he's working with the women's hockey team, and they had a big camp here. And I was talking to Dan. I'm like, Dan, like, what's the word? I'm trying to explain this to him. I'm like, what's the word that describes this idea of an athlete who can find this broad range of solutions to problems at hand, and can do this in a way that they're able to meet these unknown challenges that may arise on the field of play, in the boxing ring, wherever it may be. But they can do this, and they can do it better than anybody. And we were going back and forth. And he's like, I think we call it movement adaptability. And we talked about this from the notion of, within the world of capturing sort of the more some themes around movement variability and skill acquisition, and and that was kind of the second umbrella term, Rob, that I used for the second half of the chapter. And that's where things get into a bit of the weeds, right? Or not the weeds, but it gets a little more murky.
Hmm.
But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it thoroughly to write it, and so yeah.
As you mentioned that, I mean, you used a stat. Was it sprint cycling? Our energy to actually produce that energy that would produce what percentage of that actually goes to moving the bike itself. I thought
Yeah,
that was quite interesting actually. I know it probably made sense, but it's like 30% or something like that, or
yeah,
maybe even
yeah,
lower. Yeah, just a little simple
yeah.
stat like that impressed me. I'm a simple mind, Matt.
Yeah,
Not.
no, I know. I mean, me too. And I don't. I mean, although I kind of say from a scientific standpoint, I certainly classify myself more as an exercise physiologist, muscle physiologist, than I do a biomechanist or anything else, based on my training. I was actually sharing an office with a guy named Louis Passfield, who's published a lot of these papers in cyclists. This is one of my colleagues here at the U. He was at Kent University. He moved to Calgary a few years ago, and is a wonderful human. But he and I talked a little bit about this, and yeah, I kind of took some of his research actually to, as I was exploring the topic, and kind of gives you a sense from a mechanical efficiency standpoint that there's some room to move.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
got some room to move to create more efficient, and true by proper sense of the word, like how do we help athletes convert a higher fraction of their internal energy into the type of work that makes us move?
Hmm. So one thing that I picked up on at the end, and you put some nice figures in there and nice tables and whatnot, and it was understanding the movement solution tendencies of an individual athlete. Then that got me thinking, okay, we need to understand this. There's a nice little schematic there for people to kind of work their way through. But how do we actually try to understand that in the field, in the wild, would it be an athlete one-on-one, or would that be a even more complex, a team sport environment? So I'd love to get your thoughts on diving a bit deeper in that.
I mean, I think this is where, maybe I'll talk to. I'm trying to keep this in my lane, so I'm
Of
not,
course.
BSing the world here, because hey, let's be honest. Like this is I just full transparency. I would be lying if I said this isn't a very difficult thing to capture. But let's just talk about it from a scientific perspective. One way that today I'm currently exploring this from a scientific standpoint is I work with a company in Vancouver called Plantiga, and they do a smart insole. Basically, it's an IMU, and with IMU, you're measuring movement and acceleration and stuff like that. When individuals run, when they walk, when they jump, but more when they run and walk. Like let's say you're to capture a I don't know 5-minute run, you can absolutely see movement variability at hand in the signal, and you can see if we call these things movement maps, but you plot, it's like a phase map where you plot what the left is doing while the right is what the left is doing relative to the right. So you get these beautiful pictures of how your left moves relative to your right over time. Well, not over time, but the signal's just kind of repeated on top of
Mm-hmm.
itself.
Mm-hmm.
But you can see, it's like those sketches that you see sometimes in some of the literature on this, where they'll say like write your name 5 times fast. And I write Matt, 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 and obviously each iteration of Matt approximates the first one, but no, it is never perfectly, like the words are not perfectly, letters are not perfectly on top of each other, right? It's the same thing here. We can actually measure that, and we can see it in the signal. We can calculate stride length variability. So people are walking and running, and we can look at how much variability is there in terms of that length. And it's really interesting to note, first of all, is that on that level, I think there's going to be some, I think down the road in the next 5 years, 10 years, as we improve with our wearable tech and machine learning and all these things, I think there'll be opportunities for us to quantify this a bit better. So that's kind of my interest from a scientific standpoint. And certainly we can see when people have ACL injuries, when they've got other things going on, we'll see reductions in variability that occur. We might see variability in terms of the peaks of their acceleration signal. It's obviously if you look at the scientific literature, that's a whole thing in and of itself. But then I think the second thing that you're talking about is more now really harnessing the complexity of this. Like when you see players on the field of play doing what they do, the magic to be able to hit free throws from any angle and any position and in all these situations, and to create brilliant masterpieces of solutions to problems. I think that's where, Rob, we need more scaffolding, and we need a little bit at this stage, to be honest with you, we need some heuristics, right? Like we need some scaffolding and ways to slice and dice this problem so that we can understand it. And all I would say is that, and this is what I try to get across to the readers in this chapter is, I used a constraints-led approach as kind of an anchor point, which is not the only anchor point for how we acquire skills. And you may know this Newell's model has internal physiological constraints and task constraints and environmental constraints, and there's perception and action, and then obviously these couplings of these various constraints and how we perceive and act are what generate a broad range of solutions. And I tried to frame this up to say that we may not know exactly how to create the next LeBron, or we may not be able to create the next Messi or whatever it is, but it may not be by design. But I said that in the chapter, tried to present this model as those being the levers we could pull to help develop that skill set in an athlete. And again, this idea of helping create the scaffolding and the framework for players to acquire skills and acquire the movement capacities, the movement adaptability to be able to display, the sorts of skills that they need to on the field of play. So two pieces, stuff that I think we can measure eventually, and I can see it coming down line, as I do more in the space, and then obviously a framework for how coaches can apply maybe some thinking here to help work in this murky area.
Cool. Talking about frameworks, one thing that you present in the chapter, the strength training framework for mechanical efficiency. Let's have a little chat about that, because you start off in the chapter talking about the force length and the force velocity relationships, which people probably heard of and familiar with, or think they're familiar with it, but it'd be good to get a bit of a refresh of why those explanations and this featured in this chapter. And then you have a little chat about isometric training, which we can dive into also. But yeah, I suppose a bit of an overview of this section would be really interesting, and why you think it's necessary to provide this framework to the reader.
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, and I'm gonna just acknowledge, one of my colleagues now, and guy I did my PhD under, and man, I've had no shortage of amazing conversations with him, is Walter Herzog, who's a very well known biomechanist, but he was a coach first, so we talk about this stuff all the time, and in this context, and he did some kind of the first study that I'm aware of that maybe pointed to how adaptive our neuromuscular systems are to the types of training that we do, right? Specific adaptation to the imposed demand, like our bodies adapt to how we train. Was he did a study in, I think it was like probably in the early 90s, but where he compared, he looked at the rectus femoris muscle. It's a 2-joint muscle, obviously crosses the hip and the knee. And he did some measurements of the muscle force length relationship. So essentially, on a dynamometer, did some math, figured out, essentially the contribution that rectus femoris would have to the overall knee extension torque, and then recreated these muscle force versus angle relationships. And he did this to compare cyclists and runners. And what he was interested in was, well, cyclists are in a completely different posture than runners, because they stay on a saddle with their hip flexed as they pedal. And runners obviously are in this extended position at the hip where their muscle works differently. And so his whole exploration experimentally of this was to say, how does the sport that you do influence the relationship? And very cool little study, right? But when you look at the data, it's like, wow, it's amazing. The cyclists tended to have a relationship where they were stronger at shorter lengths, and the runners had the exact opposite, where they had a relationship where they were stronger at longer lengths for the muscle. And so, this was kind of like a first for me as a coach and as a scientist. It's like one of the first studies, not the only one, that just to show that our mechanical efficiency does, and again, I'm stretching it back to mechanical efficiency, but it's why, and this goes back to more our speculation, and maybe one day someone will prove us wrong on this, but I doubt it. It's why you've never seen a world championship cyclist also be a world championship runner. Like you can be pretty good at both. Like triathletes are clear examples of this, but at some point in time, sports specialization just takes you too far away from being able to be good at both, because our muscles adapt to how we train. So that was the one notion around the force length relationship. We also talked about in the chapter about tying the force length relationship into how. So I had an image in there about an athlete jumping, and how one of the things that may happen is that an athlete may choose the joint angles and the positions and postures that optimize their muscle power in a jump. And so I had this image of like an athlete jumping at three different depths, but there's only one depth obviously that is their sort of optimal length for generating force. And just to add on this, Rob, is another really kind of cool little study that we're working on here in Calgary. Is we've got winter sports, obviously where you skate, which is, it's got its own nuance, like you're gliding and you're on ice. You've got bobsledders who are essentially like really strong and fast sprinters. You know, they move a heavy sled to get going, and then eventually that sled's moving faster than a car, right? And they've got to kind of keep up and jump in. And then we've got alpine skiers who also have a completely different type of movement because it's the potential energy of the hill and their quasi isometric, eccentric muscle actions that sort of absorb energy and allow them to kind of like maximize their speed. And again, just to give some experimental evidence that might support that notion is when you take a look at these different sports and you compare how they jump and you compare their mechanical muscle properties in a counter movement jump, let's say, it really seems to be the case that how you jump and how you maximize jump height kind of depends on your training history, right? So, presumably what's happened is years of sports specialization, you've adapted, your neuromuscular system's adapted, and it's made you find ways to be the most efficient in a jump by using the postures and positions that work for your body. And so it's another example where, again, I think we can sort of say that our basic muscle properties like the force velocity relationship, our power velocity relationship, our force length and torque joint angle relationship, and how we express that in whole body movements like jumping, they seem to be very much adaptable to training, very much adaptable to the type of sports we do. And obviously that becomes another lever that coaches can pull to say, hey, if I want to engineer a body here, how can I tap into some of these notions with training to be able to shift things that matter and bring the athletes closer towards what they need to be able to perform at the highest level. So yeah, it's a few examples there, I think, where that ties in.
Yeah, it was something that I spoke to Danny Lum about when we discussed isometrics, and I think he was actually working with sprint cyclists and had concocted exercises and put these guys in joint angles that they were going to experience in their sport to obviously maximize force at them given angles. For something, I mean, you used similar examples in the chapter. For sports, for team sports, how important is that to identify not those ranges, because they're working in all sorts of ranges, and using counter movement jump an example, and using my personal experience as a defender jumping to win headers. For someone training those kind of athletes to jump and win headers, or jump for a line out in rugby, or jump for a ball in American football, how specific should we be getting, and should we be concerned with getting that specific when it comes to the joint angles that we use, and potentially use some of the tools that Danny spoke about, which were isometric training?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I think this kind of now comes back to a scaffolding in terms of how we're going to analyze the problem. But I mean, the first question is kind of like, well, to me as always, well, how do you play the game? And often, I know hockey, like ice hockey, is not necessarily the most popular sport in Europe, but certainly, and in the UK, but certainly, like everyone probably knows Wayne Gretzky.
Of
Who
course.
was
Yeah.
was a famous Canadian hockey player. And man, this guy just had the capacity to see the game. Like it's like unbelievable anticipation, unbelievable ability to read plays and to do things that nobody else could do. And it's so interesting that one of my colleagues here at the university used to test Wayne Gretzky
Oh, wow.
in Victoria when he was part of the Canadian hockey system, like sort of coming up as a junior and into the national team program. And it's just interesting to hear her. This is now 40 years old data, right? Wise, but she's like, he wasn't a physical. He didn't play the game through speed, power, and strength. He played the game through finesse and reading. Like it was just how, So I think that's the first part of the answer to the question that I would really challenge the readers or the audience when we're thinking about this in terms of like now efficiency of movement. Partly is like, well, how does that person play the game, and how do they dominate, and I think that's a careful an important starting point. But let's just move on from there and just really stay focused on a simplistic example. Like I think that the jump is a great idea. Like if you're a defender, and what your what you need to be able to do is to create the maximum jump height, but you need to do it in a short amount of time, because obviously if I can jump faster than you, and I need to displace down, my downward displacement is less, and I can get off the ground quicker, even though you and I might have equivalent jump heights, I'm always going to beat you to the ball unless you anticipate and get ahead of me, right? And again, if I just go back to what we see in some of our winter sport athletes, which is sort of like how Walter studied the adaptations of the runners versus the cyclists, we absolutely see different ways that people jump based on how they train and how they perform and what they do in their sport. So I would certainly think that, part of my strategy, if I was a strength and conditioning coach or fitness coach working with players who needed to play the game in that respect, i.e., I need to be able to maximize my time in the air, minimize my time on the ground. I think that the strategies to make individuals fast jumpers, to make them sort of more of a fast stretch, shortened cycle type jumper, which now plays into where are you strong, is essentially or is an essential part of the calculus, and we know it's adaptable. So if I train you at specific ranges of motion, we know that you'll get stronger there. So I think it's a clever way to approach it, and I certainly one I would be in support of, just to to fine tune how we approach problems of translating what we do in the gym to sport performance.
It's interesting. I had a guy on come on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he was he'd been a head of sports science, he'd been a fitness coach, he'd been an assistant coach and a head coach in football across Europe. And he ended up at the Seattle Sounders, Adam Owen, who was performance director, and now he's back in the UK doing lots of coach education stuff. And it comes up a lot with the guys that have that hybrid technical, physical approach and have probably done both roles, of how a deep understanding of the sport is so necessary, especially in football that is going that way with the European influence and whatnot. And that is just another example of, for me, maybe because I believe this is right, so this is what I'm hearing from what you say, but it's understanding and watching the game, not only watching the game, but understanding that rugby player to jump for a line out, or that American football player to jump and catch the ball. That guy is different to that guy. His strategy to do that on the field, not on a force play, but on a field, is this. That guy's strategy is completely different, and it's this. And understanding those to be able to create solutions for those two people.
Absolutely. And this is exactly in the very final part of the chapter I presented, just, honestly, just what I hoped would be a simple kind of recursive loop of how over time, as practitioners, we are constantly in this mode of moving from skills to context and back again as an athlete adapts over their career. And I think like an example I'd give, Rob, is like, I'll play it a little bit more to my strength in terms of sports I've worked with, but like take boxing.
Sorry, right? I keep giving English examples, don't I? I'm killing it.
No
Sorry,
worries.
Mate.
I just need to be super careful. Yeah, I just don't want to like, how it is. Like I
understand.
But this is one I rely on. So I got
it. Of
course. It plays so well to my. You take throwing a punch though, right? Like, I mean, you guys got some pretty awesome UK heavyweights right now too, right? So it's pretty good. You guys, I've been really enjoying watching them. But throwing a punch is the same sort of thing. Like it's like you have to learn the rules before you can break the rules. And so, I often say, like, I love boxing and I love to do it. I'm horrible at it, but I love going down and hitting the bag and, sometimes doing a little bit of sparring and, just light. I have no intention of doing anything beyond that. But this club I train at in the city, like it's like the fundamentals of throwing a good jab and throwing a good cross and the mechanics of how you do that is like, the coach down there teaches, whether you're the pro or you're a beginner like me, like he teaches this as though it's the most important thing you'll ever learn. It's the fundamental skills and the fundamental way to generate, your effective striking, and especially with the jab, which sets everything up. Like that's always say it's like a fundamental punch. It gives you your timing, your range. It's defensive, it's offensive, it sets all your combinations up. And so there's so much time spent on this fundamental skill. And as a beginner, I need to learn that rule before I can break the rule. But when you watch a pro fight, they can now throw jabs from different positions and angles and different ways because they understand this. They've learned the skill, which now allows them to create solutions in very authentic and novel ways. And I think that that's where, again, in this last chapter or this last figure of the chapter, it's like, okay, so you're working in this context. How is a coach constantly working through from skill? And again, whether you're the best in the world or you're the beginner, you always come back to skill in your periodization of skill acquisition, like, because there's some basic fundamentals that you don't want to get away from. How do you create contextual relevance for the skill and allow creation of new ways to apply the skill? How do you do it on demand, when fatigued, when you have to perform? And then again, back to that iterative loop, it's like, I think as coaches, we constantly have to be coming back to say, okay, how does this play into this person's strategy on the field in context? And I think you nailed that, right? It's like, well, how do you play the game first? Let's understand the context, and then let's try to move from there in terms of how we want to train. Yeah, I'll end on this note here on this thought, but shout out to Jeremy Shepard, who's also an author on one of the chapters, but he'll often say it's like we're servants to performance. Like that is our highest purpose, is performance. My role may be as a strength and conditioning coach to make you strong, make you fast, make you jump better. But we always have to remember that role is not the purpose. The purpose is performance, and we serve that. And it's now trying to think, okay, like me teaching you to jump and to improve your, whatever it may be an absolute essential thing for you. But in another case, it may not be the most important thing to be focusing on. And I think that's where it gets a bit murky, but that's where we got to use our brains and come at it from both angles.
Not to get into too much into the philosophical stuff, because I'll bring it back to the numbers in a second. But do we, and I'm talking we as strength and conditioning coaches, often lose sight of that? That our job, and it's like, I think whatever industry you're in, you think everyone's got the most important job and the hardest job. But do we often, that disconnect does come into play when we're doing exactly what you've just said, of losing that connection with us being servants of performance rather than the other way around? Like, why is the head coach taking time off the S&C? Because, we've got a shorter day, but they're keeping the technical stuff. Like, and then kicking off about that. Well, because you're just a part of the puzzle and they're actually going to get better on the field. So that kind of thing. I'm just getting, interested to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I think we are at, my experience is we're the people are prone to this. Strength and conditioning coaches are prone to this, and it's because, well, I'll give you an example of where I often see it, is that you'll see sometimes with young coaches, right? It's like and I'm guilty of this, by the way, so I can say it without pointing a finger, because I can point it right back at myself. When I was a young coach and starting off, whatever I had just learned, or whatever I had just done, or wherever my passion was at a given time, was kind of what I felt was most important for my athletes. So, I would go through, I competed in weightlifting for a few years, loved, so of course, I saw the lens of sport performance and my contribution as, I've got to teach my athletes weightlifting, because the best way to create a platform for them to train and have improvements in their sport performance was to have them snatch and have them clean. Because I loved it. It was fun to coach. And it was at that time how I saw the lens of what my job was. And just to give you a sense of, where now I move on and I go to a seminar and I learn something else. And now that becomes my thing, right? Because now I'm seeing it this way. And I move on to, now I see it this way. And you constantly see that your philosophy of training kind of evolves with where you're interested and what you like. But then as you get to a place where you're down the road and maybe you've been doing this for a minute or two, you start to see that great coaches are putting an analysis of the athlete and the context and the sport first. and they're putting their own interests of a distant second, so it becomes now, what does this person need? How do I dress training needs with the right solution, and the right approach for the given time I'm in? How am I not too attached to my own ideas and drinking my own Kool-Aid that I'm getting too lost into what I think matters? And shit, Rob, if there's, sorry to drop a little bit of a swear word
It's
there, but
fine, mate.
shit, if there's one thing where I've never seen, the one area of conflict that I see on interdisciplinary performance teams, because I work in them a lot, and I'm trying to lead them. It's when people confuse their role for the purpose, and you have a pissing match between people about what their job is and why their job's more important than your job. And honestly, that is not just for strength and conditioning coaches. It is a natural human inclination to put your needs first, and the things that you think are most important as the most important thing for everybody. So certainly an area for us to all be better at.
100%. And I think, like I said, I think every industry is guilty of it, and every human is probably guilty of it as well. But
Can
so
I say one more piece?
go
Sorry, I
for
don't
it.
mean to get into the weeds, but I'll say one more thing. The coaches that I have had the most respect for over my career, and the ones that I have really been I've really admired, are the ones who can detach themselves from all the textbook information they've learned, and they can see the problem for what it is in front of them by analyzing context and analyzing what's happening. And so it's like this capacity to remove everything you've learned, everything that you think you know, to see a new situation for what it is. Why is this athlete presenting with this solution? Why is the athlete doing it like this? And that question, like that capacity to kind of leave everything and see it for what it is, and then to generate solutions around training solutions around that person, that context, in a very creative way, where you're pulling in on good principles and good training science and all those things, but you're able to not get locked into one way of thinking. It's a massive skill, and the best coaches I know can do that on the spot.
Who would
So
be a good example? I'm putting you on the spot now. Who
Oh,
would come to mind?
who comes to mind is Andy O'Brien. There's a guy. I don't know if you've ever had Andy on your
No, I don't think I
podcast, but
have.
Andy's a great. He's a Canadian strength and conditioning coach. He's a he. I mean, honestly, he's notable because he was the personal strength coach to Sidney Crosby, who's another great Canadian hockey player. But so Andy led the Pittsburgh Penguins over a couple. I think they won 2 Stanley Cups together, with him in the lead of the sport performance side of things at the Penguins. And there's a great example of a guy who works with all kinds of athletes from all kinds of sports, and he's just got he just analyzes problems a little differently, thinks a little differently, and he's not like. I've also seen coaches who analyze problems differently, and they're absolutely squirrely in how they think they need to approach problems. But Andy's got this capacity to kind of break it down, see what's going on, figure out what needs to get done, pull from his toolbox, pull people in as he needs to, and to kind of create outside the box thinking that still gets results, and it's not and it actually makes sense. So there's a guy that I definitely hold in high regard there.
Noted. Love a recommendation, Matt. Absolutely love
Yeah.
a recommendation. So back to the numbers, back to the strength training framework. Loading for mechanical efficiency was a note that I put on the things that I fired over, because again, there's the little table in there in the chapter which explains this. But I'd love to get you just to get a bit more depth on your reasonings and your how you would load when the purpose is mechanical efficiency.
And we're talking about strength,
Yeah, the
power
strength training
training.
frame. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, and again, I'm fortunate that this is another question that I can kind of play into my background and my history, because yeah, it was a real issue. I mean, I worked with our Canadian cross country ski team for yeah, 3 or 4 Olympic cycles, and really, I really enjoyed the process because it's an example where, in the absence of using some science, people's intuition about how to train for endurance sport can be completely wrong. And so when you just do a high level analysis and you don't really, and this is where, again, I think it's a good example, Rob, where you need to think about this. It's not just walking in and being like, context, I'm going to go with my instincts and my gut here and see what I see, and I'm going to go with, we need to blend both, right? Like that's the whole point. And when you talk to people who work in those sports, the number one thing that people often say is, well, you're an endurance athlete, so you should train strength endurance. And so people typically train with, low load, high repetition schemes, and they have a slant on how to train. But what the science shows is that when you think about the three main contributors to endurance performance, your VO2 max, relatively genetically determined, right? It's hard to make big shifts in that depending upon your genetics. Your lactate threshold, which is as a key marker and a key thing around endurance exercise performance, and then you've got your movement economy, which is, the way I put it simply, in a simple analogy, it's like, you're driving a pickup truck on the highway versus a hybrid. It's like it's your oxygen consumption at a given speed, right? That we're often looking at. So you put somebody on a treadmill and you measure oxygen consumption, and what we see is that resistance training has a profound effect on that aspect of endurance performance. And so, and it's not by doing high repetition, strength endurance oriented training. It's actually through developing maximal muscle strength, rate of force development capacity, stretch, shorten cycle ability, aka plyometric ability or reactive strength. It is all those things that we associate with speed power sports that actually help the endurance athlete become more economical. And so, in the chapter, I presented some loading to say, if you wanted to improve someone's efficiency of movement, that if we can increase their capacities to generate maximal muscle strength, rate of force development, improve their focusing on neural factors, right? Neural drive, those sorts of things, stretch, shorten cycle capacity. There's a plethora of scientific evidence to show that these are ways that we can make a more economical human when they exercise and when they perform. So that's what was in there in terms of our in terms of the loading parameters. It was to say that if I kind of did a 3-zone model, a little table that I often use, where I said, focus on your plyometrics or your zone 1 ballistic training, or focus on your zone 3, which is your heavy maximal muscle strength training, and stay away from zone 2, which is more that moderate load, hypertrophy oriented training is typically how we see it. And I think I put a caveat in there. I'm not sure if it showed up in the chapter, but how you apply those methods over time, and obviously how you target them for athletes in their preparation, and when you use it, and how you make sure that you sequence things properly is the real magic, I think, of how you can create a more efficient athlete using heavy strength training and plyometric training and ballistic training. So that was the table. I do believe as well, another notion here that comes into play is the idea of strength reserve. And I think I give the example in the chapter of you can imagine a player, like a rugby player, who needs to, do some movement that, requires a certain level of strength for the sports skill. And you imagine, their ceiling, let's say it's an upper body pressing type action. Imagine that their maximal muscle strength is they can press 120 kilos versus a second athlete who can press 200 kilos. It was this notion as well that we can create a more efficient athlete, and one also who's more adaptable, because you're operating at a lower fraction of your strength reserve by boosting that ceiling of strength. And I'm not saying that in all cases, in all instances, that needs to be the goal, but certainly from the standpoint of creating adaptable athletes who can meet unforeseen demands, who can respond to environments where maybe a competitive skill now exceeds their strength capacity, to be able to do this in different postures and positions, I tried to highlight in the chapter that, maximal muscle strength, while it's not the only factor, it certainly is a factor that I think we could put in that context of how to create a more adaptable athlete by boosting that ceiling and increasing that strength reserve. So there's a few things that I tried to tease out there in the chapter.
One thing I want to dive in on again, that's movement adaptability, and going on that phrase that that your colleague came up with. And first point on that was being transfixed on a specific model. And I, in the notes that I fired over to you, tried to give an example of speed training in that, because that's my mind and that's what I seem to be seeing everywhere. I don't know if it's social media algorithms at work, Matt, but I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it everywhere. But you can use other examples as well. And the pitfalls of doing that have been transfixed on a specific model, and we're always trying to fit different athletes into those models that are in the textbook, like you mentioned, or in the online course that I'm doing, or whatever. So Can you just talk to us about the potential pitfalls to do that, and how we can help coaches kind of stay away from that and go a different route? And what is that different route?
I mean, I think I'll start with, super timely, by the way. I got a newsletter from Dan Path yesterday, from the Altus crew, and Dan was talking about his approach to this problem, right? And what I love about Dan is he kind of simplifies this down, and the guy is perpetually curious and avoids that sort of single-minded thinking where you got a hammer and everything looks like a nail. And I think that what I like about this, and again, getting back to your question about how do we avoid pitfalls, right? Is I think there, and I again try to do this in the chapter, there are absolutely positions and postures that are approximated by the world's best in various sport skills: sprinting, accelerating. And in the chapter, there's a silhouette of two elite sprinters, and that silhouette is actually recreated from a real live situation of two sprinters coming out of the blocks. Both have different body size. They both have different, muscle architecture. They're different, different body masses. There's clear differences in the physical natures of both of those individuals. And you can see that they are moving differently. But they are both approximating some key positions and postures that are absolutely essential for being able to effectively put forces into the ground to make your body go that way. And so I think starting point number one is we have to understand that. And it's like, I think this is the notion that you got to kind of learn the rules, then you can break the rules. It's really tough to come in and not have any rules and then just sort of like freelance it and say that, wow, everything's variable and everything's self-organizing and everyone just sort of figures this out. That doesn't seem to be the case to me. If it was the case, we would have a whole lot more, it'd be a whole lot more competitive to be able to go against the world's best in sport. Like it's clear that there is an element to that, but there's also a need for understanding the basics of biomechanics and how those things happen. So starting point one is learn the rules before you break the rules. Starting point number two is a careful analysis. And again, in the chapter, I gave an example of an athlete that I worked with. And I can tell you, Rob, it's one of the best examples. It's anecdotal, but it's one of the best examples where you need to stay curious. And that would be my second key point here is a silhouette of an elite sprint speed skater that I used to work with. And I provided this silhouette because this athlete did not skate like any other athlete in the sport, and certainly didn't skate like the textbooks. When you looked at them, they appeared to be quite sort of valgus at the knee. There were sort of like you just didn't see the exact postures and positions that you often would see taught to coaches. And I can remember so many coaches trying to fix her, and myself included, with corrective exercises, right? I'm going to corrective exercises. I'm going to correct your hip and your knee positions, and I'm going to correct that through strengthening and blah 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 blah. and it was all to no avail. I mean, this athlete never corrected anything because that's not how their bodies, that's not how she did it. But she still was able to effectively approximate positions and postures that she needed to. And I credit two people, a guy named Gord Bosworth. He's a UK physio slash manual therapist in your neck of the woods. And this athlete's coach, athlete's coach was from China. And I don't know, I don't think it has so much to do with, I actually think it was probably more to do with a language barrier initially that this coach had with her athletes, that she found these really creative ways to explain technique to her athletes. And she really allowed, like, she couldn't use the textbook words because that wasn't there for her. So her coaching was all by external cues, analogy, like, I want you to stay small here and make a big shape there. I want, like, the way she taught and spoke was like, by necessity, it was different. And what she was able to do was to take this athlete who did not look like every other athlete, who had different anatomy, different everything, and to be able to create a framework for her to approximate the positions and postures she needed for her to be effective in applying energy into the ground or into the ice. And between this coach and Gord Bosworth, I can remember the day that this athlete showed up into the weight room and said, "Hey, Matt, I had a session with Gord last night, and Gord did a head to toe analysis on me, and he just told me that from this point forward, I actually don't have to think anymore about trying to create better alignment and better positions and postures according to the textbook." Essentially was what she was saying. Essentially, what I do is normal for me, and we're just going to leave it. And I can remember her face being like, and I don't have to think about it anymore. We're leaving this because this is me. And man, what a liberating moment for that athlete, where they were like, yeah, I'm not trying to change my mechanics now and change what I do to fit some mold or construct or some textbook image. I am going to work with my coach to figure out how I need to hit the positions and postures that are right for me to be able to do what I need to do. And we'll measure the effectiveness of that by how well I perform. And my Lord, was that ever a liberating moment for all of us, and especially me, because I was trapped as well. I was like trying to change something that was never going to change, and honestly was counterproductive. It was a waste of energy. And so, again, you learn the rules before you break the rules, because you can't just show up there and like start making stuff up. But then once you have that, you really have to approach your athlete in front of you for who they are, where they are, and the context of, what are the things I'm going to change? What are the things I'm going to leave? And, I think on that notion of like, like, it's one of the most important skills I think coaches need to take away from this is you got to break it down, and you gotta really analyze it for who that person is, and be careful for the things that you want to change and why. That's not to say that you leave everything alone. Certainly, if things are causing pain, if they put you at a greater risk for maybe an injury or whatever, or if it's so far away from the basics in terms of how we apply energy into our world to maximize performance, those are things we need to change and coach. But if an athlete is hitting positions and postures of interest and it's working for them, we got to be we got to really approach those situations delicately, and approach it with some curiosity before we start making big wild changes in how someone moves.
I think that's a really good place to finish off, partly because you've got a meeting in 5 minutes that I need to make sure that I'm not responsible for making you late for, but I genuinely think it is a good place to wrap up. But Matt, thank you very much for joining me again for the third time. Last but not least, where can people get in touch with you, find out more about the stuff you've got going on online education-wise, social media, all the normal stuff?
Absolutely. So number one is my Twitter and Instagram handles are at Jordan Strength. So you can follow me there. I try to keep my posts pretty tight, and I'm not, try to not bombard people. I have, and then my website. So if you go to www.jordanstrength.com, I've got, 4 courses that I offer there. You can buy them as sort of a package. We do course launches twice a year, where we reduce the prices and we give sort of a special incentive for people who sign up. So if you want to get the courses today, you can do it. If you want to wait until a launch, you can sign up on my newsletter and or on my website and sort of get early access to that. And free resources and all kinds of things are there. So for people who want to learn more, I think it's probably best to go there. And I try to put a lot of the my approach, putting the science into training, and then using my trying to bring everything together into a kind of a cohesive format to help navigate this sometimes murky but oftentimes exciting and fun world that we live in. So looking forward to connecting to people if they want to learn more. And just want to say to you, Rob, thanks so much for giving me an opportunity again to be on your show. Always love speaking to you, and you're a gentleman, and I have great respect for you. So much appreciated.
Thank you very much. I didn't pay you for that as well, but I probably should do for that last little bit. No, I appreciate your time, mate. It's a pleasure and honor to have you on again. And take care, and I hope I haven't made you late for your morning meeting. But chat soon. Cheers, Matt.
Thank you.